Okay, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the director of the Dickey Center, and I want to welcome you to this talk by Scott Shane of the New York Times on leaks in the surveillance state, essentially America in the age of Snowden. It was a big surprise at the end of the year when Time magazine didn't put Snowden on the cover and say he was Man of the Year. I guess it was a surprise to people who haven't worked at Time because bad news stories don't often get to be Man of the Year stories. But it really has been the age of Snowden. And for anyone who has been inside government, their heads are probably still shaking from all of the things that have been revealed. And lots of people who are not inside government are also find their heads rattling from all the revelations of the things that have, the programs that have been conducted by the U.S. government from the perspective of those who were running them to advance our safety and security, and from the perspective of those who are not running them to denude us of our privacy and to let Big Brother into our living rooms. Well, no one has covered this story more closely than Scott Shane. For those of you who have spent any time in Washington, you know Scott is one of the, or who read the national edition of the New York Times, I should add. Scott is one of the hard-working reporters in our nation's capital, and he's been close up to this story for quite some time. He's now spent, 10 years at the Times, after a long career at the Baltimore Sun. He's covered NSA, Snowden, torture, and is writing a book right now on a subject close to my heart, Anwar al-Awlaki. He is on leave from the Times, and we're delighted that he could make his way up to the deeply frozen north, I should say. And I want to welcome him here. I also want to say that we're delighted that this event is being co-sponsored by the Institute for Security, Technology, and Society. These issues, of course, are not fleeting ones, and ISTS will be sponsoring a series of 4 talks in next term on government surveillance in the age of big data. So with that backdrop, let me welcome Scott Shane to the podium.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. Thanks to the Dickey Center and to Dartmouth for having me up here. I hope to, I'll talk for a while, cover some ground, and then hope to leave plenty of time for questions, and we can have a discussion. I'd love to hear what you think about some of these rather thorny issues. I'll talk about what I call the crisis in government secrecy, which actually has 2 sides. Both of the warring parties, I guess you could say, over government secrecy are escalating in this ongoing contest, this battle. On the one hand, we have the first real mega leaks from Bradley Manning and from Edward Snowden. And on the other hand, we've had an unprecedented string of criminal prosecutions for leaking classified information under Obama. I would argue that behind both these somewhat unexpected phenomena is technological change, new technology. And so I want to talk about that, and I want to talk a little bit about the substance of what Snowden has let out in the pros and cons, and make a somewhat paradoxical argument that the Snowden leaks are actually a great illustration of the dangers of excessive government secrecy. But let me start with a somewhat more personal story. Last July, I got a strange call from an editor in New York, actually the guy who's previous Washington bureau chief, the managing editor, Dean Baquet, and he said he wanted me to come to New York, and I shouldn't tell anyone including my immediate supervisor, why I was going, because he wasn't going to tell me why I was going, but I needed to come on such and such a day next week, and don't tell anyone, and I can't tell you what it's about, either by email or on the phone, so I'm not going to tell you. You'll find out when you get there. So it seemed a little paranoid. I wondered what was happening with Dean. But as it turned out, I was going to spend the next 2 months in a windowless room on the 16th floor of the New York Times building in Manhattan, going through 50,000 of the hundreds of thousands of documents that Edward Snowden took with him from the NSA. The security arrangements had been dictated in part by The Guardian. The Guardian had gotten these documents from Snowden and had brought us in partly for sort of legal reasons. And they had been, I think, given the fear of God by GCHQ, the British NSA, Government Communications Headquarters. And the folks from GCHQ had physically destroyed a couple of computers that The Guardian had the documents on, but The Guardian had copies, and they'd given copies to us by then. But they had also been kind of read the Riot Act and told that Chinese spies, Russian spies, and God knows who else would love to get their hands on these documents, and that The Guardian was not capable of protecting them, and they should really give them back to the government for that reason. And this had a real impact. And so they emptied out this sort of large closet at the Times and installed video surveillance. If you left the door open more than 10 seconds, guards would come running. We were given special ID cards to unlock the door. But especially they were concerned that anything that we had, any piece of equipment, might already have been infiltrated by the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else. So we couldn't bring in our phones, we couldn't bring in our laptops. And we actually had to work on brand new laptops that had had the CD drives removed and that had never been attached to the internet. And so that was the lovely work setting. It was almost, if any of you remember the movie Being John Malkovich, there's a scene on the 6.5 floor of an office building where the ceiling is very low. And that's sort of the way I felt, surrounded by these filing cabinets, working on these strange computers with a very low ceiling all summer and into the fall. If you think about, 50,000 documents may not seem like an incredible number, but we're getting used to these mega leaks. If you studied 10 of these documents a day, and they were quite technical, some were quite long, just loaded with jargon and code words. If you studied 10 a day, 5 days a week, it would take you 20 years to get through the whole collection. So we were guessing at keywords that might turn up something interesting and searching the collection. For me personally, once I learned what this was about, it was actually quite thrilling, because in 1994 and 95, another guy and I had spent a year and a half working on an explanatory series about NSA for the Baltimore Sun, the largest employer in Maryland. And we had done this almost entirely by sneaking around and talking to NSA employees, and mostly former NSA employees and people NSA calls customers, the people in government who are on the receiving end of this information. And we had gotten hold of almost no documents. So here was the it was like the keys to the kingdom, and I was allowed to rummage around in this stuff. I published, among other things, a long portrait of the agency's operations in early November. And it wasn't evident from the story, but I had gone to NSA when I'd sort of more or less identified what I wanted to write about. I gave them a list of about 30 or 35 items, which were basically, NSA eavesdropping operations, and that I wanted to include in this story. And I mention this because this is very much important for the sort of background of understanding how the press works with the government in these secret areas that are very sensitive. So I gave them the list, and I basically said, this is what we're going to write about. And it's probably fair to say they flipped out. And their initial stance was we shouldn't write about any of these. And then we kind of said, well, why don't you distinguish between the ones you really don't want us to write about and the ones you really, really, really don't want us to write about. And they cut it down, I think, to 7 items that they were most worried about. And we had several meetings and a bunch of phone calls and went over them. And a couple I ended up regretfully taking out altogether. The others we kind of trimmed back, took details out, took language out. And that's unusual, but it's unusual in terms of the extent of the engagement. But it's not unusual as a principle. And it's sort of important to know, I think. When I talk about something like this, or when it becomes known that we have engaged with the government, it's funny, you get it from both sides. You get some people who say that you're a lapdog of the government because you're asking permission for what to write. And you get other people who, even after you go through that process, because of what you do put in the paper about an agency like NSA, consider you to be a traitor, committing an act of treason. So that's basically my job. Is I'm a treasonous lapdog, I would say. And the whole process was familiar to me in part because I was the Times lead reporter in 2010 on the 250,000 diplomatic cables that WikiLeaks had gotten from PFC Bradley Manning, the Iraq analyst, Army intelligence analyst in Iraq, who put it all onto CDs and given it to WikiLeaks and eventually got to us. And we had gone through the same process of rummaging around using keywords and trying to find the interesting stuff, and then engaging with the State Department. For a while, every day, talking with the State Department, we had like a standing 5:00 p.m. Call to go over cables that we were intended to publish in the coming days and allow them to kind of weigh in on what they thought might be damaging to individuals or to others. So what's extraordinary about those 2 events? Well, they were the 2 biggest unauthorized disclosures of classified American information in American history, by far. There's nothing that really qualifies as third place, but you could give a distant third to the leak of the Pentagon Papers, the government's secret history of the Vietnam War, which, as many of you will remember, happened back in 1971. Compared to the Manning and Snowden leaks, the Pentagon Papers were actually very narrow in subject matter and tiny in their relative scale, even though they were that too is thousands of pages. To understand what's happened, it helps to recall how Daniel Ellsberg of the Rand Corporation, a defense analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers, how he actually made a copy. He and a friend who would become his co-defendant spent many nights standing for hours at a photocopier at an advertising agency that was run by his friend's girlfriend. And they were hand copying all these pages. By contrast, when Bradley Manning in Iraq decided he wanted to blow the whistle on, just about everything the government was doing, he clicked on files, copied them wholesale onto CDs, which he scribbled Lady Gaga onto it to make it look like, songs, because a lot of guys listened to music and watched movies semi-illicitly on their late-night intelligence shift. And then think about Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden flew from Hawaii, where he was working for an NSA contractor, to Hong Kong, carrying laptops with hundreds of thousands of documents on them. To carry out the Manning leak or the Snowden leak with Ellsberg's technology would have required an army of people working for months to make copies on dozens of photocopiers and like a whole fleet of tractor trailers to cart them away. In other words, you couldn't do these leaks with those technologies. But if the leakers have upped their game and used the latest technology to sort of escalate their what they would consider to be whistleblowing about government activities. It's also true that the government has escalated its campaign against leaks. There's an inherent contradiction in American democracy. We recognize that the government needs to keep some secrets, but we also believe it's crucial for the press to aggressively report on the government. When secrecy gets the upper hand, the government, and especially I think the intelligence and security agencies, can run off the rails. And when government officials will tell you with some justice that when the press gets too aggressive, intelligence sources dry up, and in rare cases, lives can be endangered. This is a conflict that can never be settled, only managed. No one's described it better than Max Frankel, who was in 1971 the New York Times Washington bureau chief and later the top editor of the paper, in an affidavit that he filed in the case that actually went to the Supreme Court when the Nixon administration was trying to prevent the New York Times from printing the Pentagon Papers. And the whole affidavit, which you can find on the web, is worth reading. Max Frankel describes listening to LBJ while LBJ was standing up to his waist in his swimming pool in Texas and was telling him all kinds of secret stuff about talks with the Soviets. But I'll read a brief passage from this really brilliant memo. This is Max Frankel. Without the use of secrets that I shall attempt to explain in this affidavit, there could be no adequate diplomatic, military, and political reporting of the kind our people take for granted, either abroad or in Washington, and there could be no mature system of communication between the government and the people. I know how strange all this must sound. We've been taught, particularly in the past generation of spy scares and Cold War, to think of secrets as secrets, varying in their sensitivity but uniformly essential to the private conduct of diplomatic and military affairs, and somehow detrimental to the national interest if prematurely disclosed. By the standards of official Washington, government and press alike, this is an antiquated, quaint, and romantic view. For practically everything that our government does, plans, thinks, hears, and contemplates in the realms of foreign policy is stamped and treated as secret, and then unraveled by that same government, by the Congress, and by the press in one continuing round of professional and social contacts and cooperative and competitive exchanges of information. Nothing Frankel described in 1971 has changed 43 years later, except that instead of spy scares and the Cold War, the secrets today, of course, more often concern surveillance and counterterrorism. And recognizing at some level this awkward dance of reporters and officials, the government for decades almost never tried to prosecute anyone for leaking classified information. Nixon tried it with Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, but the case was thrown out because the government had used illegal wiretaps. It's fun, as always, to dip into the Nixon tapes and listen to to Nixon's comment when he heard that the case was endangered by prosecutorial misconduct in 1973. He said, "The son of a bitchin' thief is made a national hero and is going to get off on a mistrial, and the New York Times gets a Pulitzer Prize for stealing documents. What in the name of God have we come to?" Anyone who's followed the heated debates around WikiLeaks and Snowden will hear an echo. In the 1980s, so there was an attempt to prosecute Dan Ellsberg in the 70s that fell apart. In the 1980s, the government successfully prosecuted a guy named Samuel Morrison who had sold classified satellite photos to Jane's, the defense publication. But his goal was making money, so it doesn't really fit into what I'm talking about here. Under the Bush administration, there was a Defense Department employee named Larry Franklin who was convicted of giving classified information not directly to the press, but to some pro-Israel lobbyists who then shared it with reporters. So again, that's sort of an oddball case. But even if you count all three of those, there were only 3 such cases before President Obama came in. Under Obama, as I said, there have been 8 such prosecutions. If we set aside Manning and Snowden as special cases, on the theory that any president would have had to do something, The others I'll just rattle off quickly because they didn't get a lot of them didn't get that much attention. There's a guy named Shammai Leibowitz, a Hebrew translator for the FBI, who gave a blogger transcripts of FBI eavesdropping on the Israeli embassy. There was an NSA bureaucrat named Thomas Drake who gave the Baltimore Sun information on a huge NSA technology contract that he considered to be a waste of billions of dollars, and in fact was a waste of billions of dollars as it turned out. There was a State Department expert on North Korea, Stephen Kim, who told Fox News about a CIA analysis of how Kim Jong-il might react to new sanctions. There was a Farsi-speaking former CIA officer, Jeffrey Sterling, who told a colleague of mine about a supposedly botched attempt to sabotage Iran's nuclear program. And there was an FBI bomb expert just recently, Donald Sackelben, who told the Associated Press about a second attempt by the al-Qaeda branch in Yemen to blow up a plane with an underwear bomb. That's 7 cases. The 8th case I'm obligated to say a little more about because it involved me. I'm sorry to say. John Kiriakou was a CIA officer for 14 years, first as an analyst, and then he became an undercover officer, operations officer, against terrorist groups first based in Greece and later after 9/11 in Pakistan. And in 2007, like most CIA folks, he retired and was fairly invisible. But in 2007, after leaving the agency, he became the first former CIA officer to speak publicly about waterboarding in an interview with ABC. And he defended the agency's use of it in the dire circumstances after 9/11, but said he thought it was torture and that it should no longer be used. A lot of us, rushed to hunt him down after he went public, and I would talk to him from time to time, as I would talk to just about anyone from the CIA who was willing to talk to me. And one time in 2008, I was trying to find another CIA officer by the name of Deuce Martinez, who I'd heard was involved in interrogating Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, as he's known, the chief architect of the 9/11 plot. And Kiriakou had worked with Deuce Martinez, and he said, I think I have his business card, because both of them were retired from the CIA at that point. And he handed over his business card, and I copied down the information. I still couldn't find him, and we exchanged a couple of emails later, I did with John Kiriakou. Well, I was quite shocked when in 2012, I was sitting at my computer, and in my email list, I saw a kind of routine press release from the Justice Department came up, and it said, CIA officer John Kiriakou charged, under the Espionage Act. And I was sort of horrified, and particularly horrified when I read that one of the counts in the indictment was our exchanges. Because even though Deuce Martinez was not undercover, and therefore it was not a crime to talk about him, and he was long out of the agency, and the operation that I had talked to Kiriakou about, in part, was involving a terrorist, the capture of a terrorist early on named Abu Zubaydah, that had been announced at the time and widely discussed. But the CIA considered the fact that Deuce Martinez had participated in the operation to capture Abu Zubaydah, that was classified, and that though I knew that Kiriakou had confirmed that to me and had therefore revealed classified information, and that was literally an account in his indictment. He had also been charged with talking to another reporter. I won't go into details. He's got young kids. He was facing a potential prison term of 10 or 15 years, and he just didn't want to roll the dice, and he pleaded guilty to one count, not the count involving me, but a different count of the indictment, and he's currently at a federal prison in Pennsylvania serving 30 months. That's a real shocking thing to go through as a reporter, I can tell you. And obviously, as someone who has talked to the reporter, it's a lot worse. So the government has escalated its war on leakers in a stunning manner. And I would say with no obvious reason. We've burned a lot of reporting hours trying to figure out why you would have expected this perhaps in the years right after 9/11. Dick Cheney was very, exercised about leaks. Every president is exercised about leaks. You would have thought that if there was a crackdown, it would have been sort of, under the Bush administration after 9/11. Not so. In fact, if you think back, leaks of classified information in 2004 and 2005 disclosed to the American people for the first time that the CIA was operating secret prisons overseas, that its interrogators were using waterboarding and other methods the U.S. had always treated as torture, and that the NSA, for the first time in more than 20 years, had bypassed the law and was eavesdropping on U.S. soil without court warrants. That was all classified information that was revealed only because of illegal leaks to the press. Would any of you argue, well, let's have a show of hands, would anyone here argue that we Americans would all be better off if we had never learned any of those three secrets? Okay, I agree with you. And a senator named Barack Obama also agreed with you. He built his presidential campaign in part on his outspoken opposition to exactly those secret programs, which he described as excesses and mistakes of Bush counterterrorism policies. Only because the programs had been leaked was Obama able to discuss them publicly. So what's behind this string of leak prosecutions? Is Barack Obama that much more of a hardliner than Dick Cheney? I don't think so. I don't think he ever sat down, as far as we can tell, he never sat down and said, let's change decades of American practice concerning classified information. No, I think the major reason is the same phenomenon that enabled the Manning and Snowden leaks, technology. Snowden, of course, outed himself. He, as you recall, went to Hong Kong and made a video for The Guardian and named himself as the source of his leak. So no investigation was necessary. But in all 7 of the other cases, there was an electronic trail of emails, or in Manning's case, chat logs, online chat logs, that helped the FBI solve the case and figure out who was the leaker. If you talk to FBI agents who worked on leak cases in the 80s and 90s, they'll tell you that even when top officials pushed the investigations, which they often did not, they were usually difficult or impossible to solve because they'd find out that 500 or 1,000 people knew the information in question, and they would just throw up their hands and say it's going to be impossible to find out who was involved. Today, if you think about it, if I write a story and it has a piece of classified information in it, it takes a matter of seconds for someone to go into the agency that was holding that information, their internal email system, and search for my name. And they can, if they're lucky, they can find, well, here are 6 employees who've been in contact with Scott Shane in the last 5 years. Which of these employees was cleared for this information, works on this topic? Aha. And they can narrow the field very, very quickly, and I think that's what happened in these cases. So I actually think that what's driven this has been the proliferation of electronic records and not some philosophical decision at the top. Now you can understand why reporters like me are being a whole lot more careful with what we put in email these days, and why some government officials have become reluctant to talk about things they've long talked about. Prosecutors in these leak cases sometimes pretend that a bright line separates the classified from the unclassified. That's really not so. Let's take the CIA's drone strikes in Pakistan. Technically, they're highly classified. They're a covert action program. But President Obama has spoken about them multiple times in public, gave a whole speech about the drone program. Is it classified or not? Michael Hayden, none other than Michael Hayden, the former director of both NSA and CIA, said a year or so ago that he was no longer clear on what he was allowed to say about the drone program. So if he doesn't know, nobody knows. In fact, this is nothing new. There's always been a kind of gray zone, a DMZ, between the classified and the unclassified. And it's actually in that zone that national security reporting takes place. In that zone is where reporters and government officials meet to talk carefully about things like drone strikes and NSA surveillance. That kind of reporting has gotten far harder to do over the last few years. Any reporter and any official who works in national security can tell you about the chill that's come over the process of reporting in Washington that Max Frankel described in 1971. it won't surprise you to learn that I think that's a very bad thing. You know, those who think that leaks were out of control, their whole purpose was to chill those exchanges. So they would say it's a great thing. But I spent several years reporting from the Soviet Union in the last years of Soviet power in Russia, and saw what it's like to give the government complete control over what's secret and what's not. It's lethal for democracy, of course, but it's also disastrous for government effectiveness. I actually wrote a whole book about the role of information in the Soviet collapse. Now I'm working on a book about the life and death of Anwar al-Awlaki, the Yemeni-American cleric who joined al-Qaeda in Yemen, was killed in a drone strike in 2011. He's been dead for going on 3 years, but a lot of people are still in the government are still terrified to talk about him. It's bad luck for me, but I think it's just emblematic of something that I think is actually bad for democracy and potentially even for security. If you talk to Tom Kean, the former New Jersey governor who was chairman of the 9/11 Commission, he'll tell you that excessive secrecy on the part of the government and agencies hoarding information from each other and from the public made the U.S. vulnerable to attack. It wasn't leaks, in other words, that endangered the security before 9/11. It was secrecy. Now let's go back to that windowless room at the New York Times where we were poring over classified NSA documents. Why did Edward Snowden decide to risk his career and his freedom to expose these NSA programs? Some will say he's just a reckless egomaniac. Others that he's a man of conscience troubled by violations of the Constitution. It's obviously an extremely polarized debate. But let me point out a side note in terms of causes and motivations. Snowden himself has said that he was inspired in part by the example of Thomas Drake, that NSA guy who was prosecuted for telling the Baltimore Sun about what he thought was a wasteful contract program. Snowden says he saw Drake as a noble whistleblower, a kind of hero. He'd only heard of Thomas Drake because Drake was prosecuted. Before he was prosecuted, Drake was a faithless bureaucrat at NSA, lost in the sea of 35,000 people out there at Fort Meade. He was a Republican. He was a national security guy. He hadn't thought a lot, I think he'd probably tell you, about civil liberties and privacy. He's now been transformed into a wild-eyed, outspoken, radical civil libertarian who goes around to college campuses and gives talks about how terrible NSA is and how terrible the government is. So, think about that. Snowden was inspired to leak by the results of the leak crackdown itself. There's a lot of people in the government who are worried about this very deeply right now. They're thinking about, in the army of young tech-savvy people and idealistic people who've been hired by the agencies since 9/11, how many might be inspired by the example of Edward Snowden? Finally, I want to talk briefly about the effects of Snowden's leaks. There's absolutely no doubt that NSA's eavesdropping has been hurt. Everybody from foreign diplomats to al-Qaeda plotters are certainly being more careful today about what they see on their phones, put into email, put on the internet. To use one obvious example, Angela Merkel, among many others, undoubtedly has upgraded her cell phone. And on a more serious note, the chance of a successful terrorist attack has probably grown by at least a little bit as a result, maybe a tiny bit. But I would not argue that it's been unaffected. But it's also true that some NSA programs Snowden revealed have stirred broad opposition both from the public and from Congress, notably the one that records details of billions of phone calls made by Americans. It's a classic case, to my way of thinking, of what happens when the government is permitted to operate in total secrecy. It gets out of whack with public opinion. We saw it in the 70s when the Senate's Church Committee took a hard look at CIA, FBI, NSA, and found stuff that they were doing that the public and the Congress didn't like. Public servants start doing stuff the public doesn't want them to do. There's no feedback. There's no check. Now President Obama himself has proposed major reforms to that particular NSA program, which are still under debate. And in a development that shocked a lot of people, especially people at NSA, there's been the first debate of whether and when the U.S. should spy on allies. back in the 1990s when I was sneaking around trying to talk to people about NSA, the notion that the U.S. should preserve and honor some privacy rights for foreigners would have been considered preposterous, ridiculously naive, unworthy of discussion. But now President Obama himself has started just such a discussion. As we saw, Obama based his campaign for president in part on leaks under President Bush. On his first day in office, he promised to run the most transparent administration in history. Instead, he's overseen one of the most secretive administrations ever and has presided over this unprecedented and unselective crackdown on leaks. You know, President Obama said early in the Snowden saga, and maybe not very convincingly, that he welcomed the debate over surveillance at home and abroad that Snowden had started. Well, it's fair to say now, welcome or not, he's got a debate. So why don't I stop there? That should be enough to start a lively debate of our own. Thanks.
Sir. So I wondered, when Obama became president, did he possibly have access to information he lacked that made him more willing to continue or to grow the programs that the executive branch was running?
Well, you know, it's funny. That's a great question. I think the answer is yes. I think part of it is if you're the President of the United States, it's very different from being a United States Senator. It's all on you. And particularly in the area of terrorism, you're briefed every day about god-awful threats, you know, coming from seemingly every direction. And, you know, many people in the government who've been on the inside, I'm sure Dan would affirm this, it does change your perspective. And, you know, and he has talked about this a little bit, Obama has, about the responsibility, his first responsibility being to protect the American people. And, you know, something that I think had a big effect on the Obama administration and on the president in particular is, if you remember back to Christmas Day in 2009, the first underwear bomber got on a plane headed to Detroit and tried to blow it up, and, you know, the bomb didn't go off. That was at a time when Dick Cheney was running around saying this president has, by shutting down the CIA secret prisons and ending the harsh interrogation tactics, had made the country unsafe. So there was a whole kind of narrative out there that this president was endangering the country. I think if that plane had blown up, it's easy to imagine Obama being a one-term president who spent, you know, his whole first term focused very much on counterterrorism and not much else, no health care. And so, you know, I think that kind of thing would cause a president to focus on this stuff and to value the information that these agencies are turning up. You know, everybody who's been on the receiving end of NSA information, and the sweep of it is sort of stunning. I mean, you know, they listen on trade negotiators from other countries. So if you're a U.S. trade negotiator, you often get, you know, each morning a secret, folder with info that says, well, here are the instructions for the people across the table from their capital. You know, here's what the the Turkish authorities have authorized the Turkish negotiators to do. You know, it's hard to imagine a trade negotiator who's going to say, no, I don't want to have that information. You know, when I did a story on NSA in November, the example I used at the top of the story was that before a meeting last April with Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, at the White House, a fairly routine meeting between Ban Ki-moon and Obama to go over a number of, you know, kind of things where the U.S. had an interest in various UN activities. NSA, you know, somehow got a hold of his talking points and delivered them to the White House. The White House wouldn't say whether Obama read them, whether they, you know, completely changed his notion of how he should conduct this meeting with Ban Ki-moon. But you kind of have to doubt it. You know, I mean, this stuff isn't terribly. It's not terribly hard to imagine what Ban Ki-moon's going to say on various topics, and so you can easily imagine that Obama didn't even bother to read the talking points. But, you know, if you can have that advantage, are you going to say no? And And I think what's happened in the pre-Snowden era is that, generally speaking, that advantage has been cost-free. It's been all benefit. You know, so the NSA's basic policy has been to suck up anything it can suck up and pass it to the relevant government official, and you know, and hope it does some good. But once this stuff gets exposed, there's obviously a political cost. In the case of Germany, it's been, and Brazil, some other places, it's been quite a steep political cost. So now they kind of have to worry about you know, what the price is of eavesdropping on allies, if they have to worry, as apparently they do, that it may not remain secret.
Yes? I'm curious about the extent to which a reporter like you needs to be tech savvy in this age. Do you write or read code? Would it help you to do that?
Well, I mean, that's something that's being discussed intensively by journalists these days. And I actually did get a public key, which is, you know, basically a string of characters that you can use to encrypt messages, emails, and started using it on rare occasions, you know, last year, mostly having to do with some of this Snowden-related stuff. But I have to say that most reporters are not terribly tech savvy and are not cut out to be, you know, covert intelligence officers, to put it mildly. And in the history of the leak prosecutions, the attempts that have been made to protect, you know, by reporters and sources to protect themselves have not gone very well. For example, Thomas Drake, in communicating with a Baltimore Sun reporter, used something called Hushmail, which is a commercial encryption program. You know, when the FBI came and took his hard drive, they found Hushmail, they found all the, you know, unencrypted versions of the message along with the encrypted versions, and the use of Hushmail was used in his prosecution to show that he knew this stuff was classified and he shouldn't be sharing it. So it backfired. Similarly, when Stephen Kim, the North Korea expert, was giving information to James Rosen of Fox News, he set up a separate, you know, sort of throwaway email account, not his usual email. And again, the FBI found it, and he was in the position of having to explain, well, if you didn't think there was anything wrong with talking with James Rosen, then why did you set up this special email account? So, you know, it's a two-edged sword, and I haven't really, you know, I know somebody who set up a Skype account using a credit card of an acquaintance that he gave him cash, and you know, hopes that maybe that will protect him, his sources a little bit. But it's very tough, you know. I mean, it's you know, as we have learned from the Snowden documents, there's very little that happened. There's very few electrons that move out there that are beyond the reach of the government these days.
In fact,
you quite accurately point out at the beginning of your talk about NSA supporters, Snowden's leaks are treason, libertarians, Snowden is doing the right thing. And that's kind of a no-win argument. My question is this mass gathering of data effective for the preservation of national security? There was a picture of Laura Poitras in the Times Magazine this summer taking a picture of this huge operation that's being built in Utah. And just wondering, in this middle area, this mass gathering, are we safer, or are we so buried in detail and stuff that we're not?
You know, that too is a question that you can't really, you know, answer, with a yes or no, obviously. But I mean, one thing that the experience of immersing myself in 50,000 NSA and GCHQ documents made me think about were the limits of intelligence. For example, the coverage in Afghanistan, as illustrated in this collection of documents, is just stunning. I looked, I wrote in this story in November, at a daily report from NSA in Kandahar, basically, in Kandahar, where sort of Taliban's home territory, and they were just all over everything. They're listening to government officials. They're listening to seemingly everybody with the Taliban. They're listening to people who've gone on the kill list and tracking them down, so that the soldiers can go find them and kill them or capture them. It just seemed like they had thrown a blanket over the whole area, and there was nothing that happened that escaped their attention. And that goes all the way up to the offices of Hamid Karzai and you name it. But how is the Afghan war gone? Here we are. We may know everything that Hamid Karzai is thinking, but it hasn't helped us a lot in these negotiations with him. And similarly, there was stuff in these documents that showed that NSA had helped a great deal in tracking Syria's chemical weapons. We knew who, which countries were violating sanctions by supplying certain components, and we sort of watched the whole collection get put together, but it didn't prevent the weapons from being used. So part of this is about the limits of intelligence, and part of it is just very hard to know. Even from 50,000 documents, we don't really know what the outcome of all this stuff is, how useful it was. Take Ban Ki-moon. I don't know if Obama read those talking points or whether he thought they were useful, whether they were, gave him an edge up that made a difference. The panel that Obama appointed to go over the NSA, the most controversial of the NSA programs, they, somewhat to my surprise, concluded that they really had not been very useful in preventing terrorist attacks. Some counterterrorism people would say that a major terrorist attack is such a rare event that just because you don't have 17 major plots that were stopped by a program doesn't mean the program is useless, because tomorrow they may get pick up the next big plot. But I guess my judgment, as somebody who's been wallowing around in this world, is that all these agencies have probably gotten a little too big with the rush of spending after 9/11, that they have gotten a little too aggressive on the privacy front. And why wouldn't they? If I'm an FBI analyst, and I know that a counterterrorism analyst, and I know that I may get a call, be awakened at 2 a.m. on some night, and given a name or a phone number, and be told, we think this may be part of a cell that's operating and is about to attack the United States. I want to have all the data in the world, in my data bank, ready to ping, because you're asking me to do something very, very difficult. So I understand the motivation of the folks on the side of the government, but to put it mildly, sweeping surveillance is not what defines the United States, and what made us great. And having watched up close and lived in a country where they really did have control over what people were saying and thinking and plotting, I wouldn't choose that. I wouldn't choose perfect security, certainly. So I think it's probably all gotten a bit out of whack in the post 9/11 era, but that's for people to debate.
Sir.
I was kind of surprised when the Snowden thing broke that a certain macho attitude at NSA, which I first heard 30 years ago, is still there. It was the head of internal security, computer security within NSA, told me back then when I asked, do you use the Orange Book? The Orange Book being a prescription put out by the NSA about what security measures should be on computers that are sold to the government.
Right.
And he said, we don't use that. He said, we don't need that. If you mess with my computers, I break your leg. That really doesn't work when there are so-called super users on the computer who can look at everything, which Snowden was.
Yeah.
And it amazes me that NSA internally apparently made no efforts to limit the capabilities of super users.
Well, yeah. Well, part of what he was doing was cyber counterintelligence, I'm told. Part of his job was to look for intrusions by others into government systems. And that's almost like being the, the fire inspector or something. You're at work and they say, the fire alarm's going to go off at 11:15, but don't worry about it. That's just the fire inspector. I think that kind of was what Snowden was doing. He would say, don't worry, it's just me. Meanwhile, filling, all kinds of thumb drives with data.
Sure.
You ever sort of feel funny, like you're having to adopt the mentality of the people you're reporting on? And like, for instance, you said you had these phone calls every day. Were you worried about establishing such a connection that it would be secure, that maybe they wouldn't turn it around and just listen to what you have security people that would sort of be counter cyber people working for you that would be able to see if that phone, or do you just say, well, if they want to let it out, fine?
Usually we don't have huge secrets at the newspaper. We're sort of in the business of putting information out instead of holding it in. So it's not usually a problem. This was a strange situation, and with WikiLeaks too, where we were sitting on a massive cache of classified and confidential data, and we didn't actually want it all to go out there. And so we did take a lot of precautions, and we did have internal tech people working on that kind of thing. Some people believe, some critics of papers like the Times who object to, I'm thinking of a journalist named Glenn Greenwald, who was a columnist for Salon for years and now is starting a new journalism venture, which he says will have a different sort of approach to all this stuff from the New York Times, which is usually his whipping boy. But he objects to the fact that we consulted, that we consult the government about these classified things before deciding. We decide ourselves what to publish, obviously, but we do listen to the arguments. And people like him accuse us of being subservient to the government. And I think there is a little bit of a danger in, you always hear this about reporters, that a reporter gets too close to his sources, starts sort of seeing the world through their eyes, defending their actions sometimes that don't deserve defending, and sort of loses his status as an independent observer. So it's always a bit of a danger. And maybe, at times I've sort of gyrated back and forth about, in my view of NSA, am I not being tough enough on them on the one hand, or am I sort of a vandal just throwing juicy little tidbits into the newspaper to titillate the readers, without really worrying about what damage they may do?
Yes. Scott, you said at the outset that there are things governments should be able to keep secret, or at least our government. And yet you were, critical of the prosecutions. Now, I, like you, am glad that there were leaks over black sites and over waterboarding and other things that, I think time has shown to be manifestly illegal. But where do you draw the line then? How does the government maintain any secrecy at all if it doesn't have prosecutions for unauthorized leaks? And how can it, one of the problems here, of course, is we're talking about the executive branch and the fourth estate. There are two other branches of government that, fourth estate's not a branch of government, last I checked, but there are two other branches of government that are involved here that have oversight responsibilities. and which, in the case of the programs that Snowden has leaked, which effectively signed off on these things, even if they didn't understand them all the time. So there was democratic legitimacy there. How do you draw that line between, where the prosecution should happen, where they shouldn't?
I mean, I guess I would answer by saying that even though I don't think anyone sat down and designed the system as it worked in the years before this recent rash of leak prosecutions, to my way of thinking, worked pretty well. I knew people who lost their security clearance, which of course in some lines, for some people means they have to change careers basically. I knew people who were put on unpaid leave. I knew people who had letters of reprimand put in their file. Undoubtedly there were people who, didn't get a promotion or didn't get a job because of being implicated in some kind of leak. So there was a process that was going on. I think it's, I think what's happened is that there's the instrument used to prosecute leaks is the Espionage Act of 1917, which you can tell from its very name was not designed for this purpose. And Stephen Kim is the guy who was charged with leaking to Fox News. I can tell you that Stephen Kim, who just very reluctantly pleaded guilty and is going to serve 13 months, he's, based on everything I've seen of him, he's a patriot. He came to this country, his parents came to this country as immigrants from South Korea. He came with them. He grew up, got a PhD. He's sort of a nerdy expert on North Korea who's done, by all accounts, he's briefed Dick Cheney. I mean, he's done great work on North Korea for years and years and years. I don't know, because they've never really said what damage might have been done by the leak in his case. Maybe it's significant. The substance of what he leaked to Fox News wasn't. It was basically CIA speculation about how Kim Jong-il might respond to sanctions. So it didn't seem super sensitive, but the impact of these prosecutions is kind of amazing. His parents have basically bankrupted themselves, paying for his legal defense. His sister, ditto. His parents moved back to Seoul and sold some real estate they owned there to pay the bills. His marriage broke up. It's totally destroyed this guy's life. And as far as I can tell, he's a total patriot. He was also introduced to James Rosen of Fox News by a State Department public information officer who said, explain to this guy Rosen, about North Korea and all that stuff. And then, they struck up a relationship and exchanged emails and calls and so on. And perhaps he went too far. But the idea that he should go to prison for 13 months, I would question that. So I think what's happened is there's this very blunt instrument that is being used that hasn't been used in the past. I mean, I guess I would say, your question is, well, what if we don't prosecute? Well, we didn't prosecute basically for decades, and the Republic still stands. So I guess going back to what seems to be a more, first of all, a certain understanding, as you get from the Max Frankel affidavit, that that we live in a democracy and people deserve to know what their government's up to a degree, and that the government grossly overclassifies things, and that you can't just say if it's classified, no one should ever write about it, no one should ever know about it. That way, madness lies. And so that there might be a more incremental, a more sort of common sense approach to the subject. And again, it would be one thing if someone could show me why in 2009, 2010, suddenly the problem was much worse than it had ever been, and now we have to do all these things. It has, I would say Snowden and Manning are special cases, and I suspect we'll see more of that. But the ordinary leaks have gone on, throughout, as so well, throughout the history of American government, and why we have resorted to these draconian prosecutions now. Again, I think it's because we have, we have better evidence.
Yes.
You just said we'll see more of Snowden and Manning. Why?
Cases like?
I mean, cases like theirs, yeah.
Yeah,
leaks on that
I
scale.
understood that's what you meant.
Well,
but-
why-
but
why-
so-
I mean,
so
I'm-
an implication from that is that
Yeah.
there has been no real chilling effect on other prospective leakers.
Well-
If I'm at DIA or some other intelligence agency that hasn't gotten a big profile recently,
Yeah.
and I pick you as the guy I want to talk to,
Yeah.
do you want that responsibility?
Well, yeah, bring it on. But I don't. But that's more in the kind of, if someone at DIA had a program that he wanted to talk about, or a problem, or a mistake, or a cover-up, or an act of fraud, that's the more standard thing. Like someone's troubled by something, talks to a reporter about one thing. So that's somewhat different from Manning and Snowden. You know, when Manning happened, I remember writing a kind of analysis piece for the Times about whether the WikiLeaks phenomenon was ushering in a whole new era in journalism and in government. And basically my answer was probably not, because WikiLeaks, basically no one had heard of it until Bradley Manning dumped all those documents. So he seemed to be a kind of one-off, and he was, you know, being intensively prosecuted at that time, subsequently has been sentenced to 35 years in military prosecution. And I thought that would be, you know, a pretty serious deterrent from anyone else who wanted to do that. But I've really had to rethink that since Snowden came along. I mean, Snowden watched the Manning case and did what he did. And what did he do? He flew to Hong Kong. He's now in Russia. He's avoiding prosecution so far. He's, you know, arguably royally screwed up his life. He certainly changed his life profoundly. But I also think he feels very rewarded by what he did. He's started an unprecedented debate about privacy and surveillance in many countries, and particularly in the US. And half of the American public in polls, roughly, half of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, it doesn't break down along party lines, are very unhappy about some of the programs that he revealed. So he feels, you know, like he did the right thing, and history will portray him as a hero. You know, but the other thing is, you know, how many people, I think more than 100,000 people work in the intelligence community. That's a lot of people. So the oddball combination you find in Edward Snowden or Bradley Manning, who are very different from each other, you know, but you'll find every kind of, you know, peculiar or you know, wondrous character there is on Earth in the intelligence community. And so I think that's what they're worrying about now, and especially because they've gone, you know, Keith Alexander, the director of NSA until just recently, has gone to the big hacker conventions, and, you know, he's a general. He dressed down in jeans and looked kind of awkward in jeans and t-shirt in order to recruit young, rebellious, libertarian, tech-savvy hacker types into the NSA because they're hacking into, you know, Al-Qaeda for that matter. And but those people you're going to have to start worrying about, you know, like how many of those people are going to decide, you know what, I don't like this program, I don't like that program, and they've got the means to do something about it. Yes.
I'm an avid media reader, but beyond
Good,
that,
good.
no expertise. And I was very unflabbergasted by Snowden's revelations. So I wonder, when you heard back in the day when we first had Homeland Security and a code red and a code orange and a code yellow, and there were lots of news reports about, but the chatter says this and the chatter says that, and what did you think was going on? What happened is exactly what I thought was going on. What did you think?
Well, I am a kind of strange person to ask of that because I spent a year and a half in 94 and 95 looking at NSA. And even then, and we're talking about, you know, basically a pre-internet, pre-cell phone era, even then the scope of what NSA was collecting was pretty stunning. And I was surprised to learn, for example, then by talking to former U.S. trade negotiators that NSA was, you know, giving them the other side's, you know, talking points and instructions, you know, to help them, because I didn't, you know, somehow I didn't think that trade negotiations, you think more about, nuclear weapons and, terrorism, maybe drug cartels, but trade negotiations, but they were getting into everything. And this was the 90s, so this was, NSA was a big Cold War agency desperately looking for other things to do to keep from being downsized post-Cold War. So I wasn't surprised by all that. But I think a lot of people were, and even the collection of metadata about phone logs of Americans' calls was not brand new. In 2006, USA Today had a story that pretty much said that a bunch of major phone companies were turning over call data to the government and to NSA. But I think the impact of seeing these documents and seeing the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court order, renewing approval for this collection, and it just rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. I was surprised at how surprised people were, and I was a little surprised at how angry a lot of people were. I was particularly surprised at how angry and upset a lot of people in Congress were. And if you talk to people at NSA, they're a little more cynical about that. They say that some of the people who are grandstanding against this program were fully briefed on it, knew all about it, and thought it was great until it was exposed. Yes. Oh, sorry. Who's been up the longest? Okay, sorry. I've been neglecting your corner.
While the mainstream media and reporters suggest that they're very discriminating in how they reveal classified information in the news, when Jack Anderson in the Washington Post and Washington Merry-Go-Round publishes the identity of James Lilly, the station chief in Beijing, China, therefore shutting down his operations, revealing who he is, and ending a man's career, can you comment about that person's capabilities and the reporter for doing so in the Washington Post?
Well, it's funny, Jack Anderson revealed a number of things. I think he revealed Gamma Guppy, which was the NSA program to eavesdrop on the Soviet leaders' limousines, the radio phones in the Soviet leaders' limousines as they cruise around Moscow. So, in a case like that, I'd have to, I don't remember that case. I guess in order to have a judgment on it, I would have to look at the pros and the cons. Usually, inside the newspaper, when we talk about this stuff, it's, it can be a fairly open and fairly, fierce debate. Usually the reporter wants to run stuff and the editor is more cautious, but not always. And usually it's a question of how newsworthy is it? Are we revealing wrongdoing? Are we revealing illegality? Or are we just informing the public about something that's happening? Is it important? Is it not that important? Is there some way to write it without revealing the name of the station chief? All those questions would normally get discussed. I didn't have the impression that the late Jack Anderson always played by those rules. But it's a good question. I mean, undoubtedly there are cases in which we publish things that cause serious damage. In fact, I have gone to both NSA and CIA now for years, and said, declassify a case, even a Cold War case, a dated case, in which a leak to the press did grave damage, because I want to write about it. And so far, nobody's taken me up on that. Yes.
You've noted several times that the philosophy inside the NSA seemed to be, if we can get it, we should scoop it up.
Yep.
I was on sabbatical in Berlin this fall and was there when the news of Angela Merkel's cell phone being hacked, not just while she was in her current position, but long before, when she was an irrelevant legislator from the East. I saw basically 60 plus years of goodwill built on the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, everything else evaporate overnight. It seems like somebody in the system should have had the responsibility of saying, if this leaks, what's the damage? what's the trade-off? What can we gain from tapping Angela Merkel's cell phone that would be worth what we lose when it leaks?
Well, NSA has been fairly leak-proof historically, and so they've had the incredible advantage, as I indicated, of saying, yeah, we'll pick it up, why not, and not worrying about whether there would be some cost down the road. That's completely changed, as you point out, and now it's really tough. Now it's really tough I would think, and I don't know that they've institutionalized. It'd be really interesting to know inside NSA. They have something called the Media Leaks Task Force, which is basically the Snowden task force, and it's headed by the guy who just became the deputy director of NSA, I think they must be thinking about that right now. It's like, before it's just been cost-free. We collect it. The other thing, of course, has happened, and we can all understand this from our personal lives. How much effort is it for you to do a Google search? You have to type a word and hit enter. And it takes whatever it says up there, right? 600,000 results in 0.0003 seconds. That's basically NSA at work. I mean, they set up these systems, and the systems are sucking this stuff up. And whereas back in the 60s, NSA had rail cars filled with magnetic tape that they hadn't gotten around to listening to, now they can automate so much of it, especially with text, that that they can basically just tell the computer, wake me up if Angela Merkel says anything interesting, and so it's very tempting to do it. And now, there's a reckoning, and how, where we go from here is anyone's guess. Yes.
I was wondering if you see a future where journalists could be successfully prosecuted for reporting on these stories.
That's a great question. If you read the Espionage Act, as written, you could certainly use it to prosecute journalists, especially under the section that deals with communications intelligence, which is NSA's bailiwick. So they could definitely prosecute me, for example, and the New York Times for printing the stuff we've printed. Historically, they basically haven't done that. There have been a couple of sort of, they've kicked it around a few times. A former NSA director, now dead, once famously said at a press conference of James Bamford, who's written several books on NSA, "You, sir, I consider to be an unconvicted felon." And so some people in the government would love to do it. Why not go after the people actually printing this stuff? But historically, many administrations, all the administrations basically have decided that the First Amendment is too important. You could challenge such a prosecution on First Amendment grounds, and who knows how it would come out. But the one case that apparently is not going to go anywhere, but opened the door in recent times, is WikiLeaks. There's been a grand jury that's spent years now, a couple years now, looking, 3 years probably, looking at WikiLeaks and trying to decide whether to prosecute, whether they can prosecute, or they want to prosecute, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and maybe others for having taken the information from Bradley Manning. And there were various theories being bandied about among lawyers. Could you say that the WikiLeaks folks were an accessory to Bradley Manning's crime of leaking classified information? Was it a conspiracy, where they conspired to break the Espionage Act? The problem with that, from the point of view of somebody like me, is that there basically is no fundamental distinction between what I do and what Julian Assange does. He takes information from government officials and he publishes it. There may be a difference in attitude, politics, scale, maybe, but it would be very difficult for, I think, the government to prosecute WikiLeaks and not prosecute the New York Times. but a lot of us have watched that grand jury in Virginia with great interest to see what they might come up with. Sure.
You were in this room with very low ceilings and 50,000 documents. What type of keywords were you really looking for, or you would say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we were looking, first of all, we were sort of wallowing around in them and trying, first you had to have, actually I did a search for the word, I learned early on to search the word glossary. And then I printed out a bunch of glossaries because everything NSA does has a code word. For example, they collect text messages all over the world and put them into a giant database which is called Dishfire. And these are random code words. But until you know that Dishfire is a text message database, an SMS database, none of these documents make any sense to you. So first, I collected a lot of glossaries and studied these keywords, and gradually you kind of get the lingo and you begin to understand things more. But beyond that, we were looking at Iran. What's there on Iran? And I found this wonderful example of what NSA does. One of the things that was surprising about a little bit even to me, even though I knew something about the agency, was that they spend a huge effort essentially expanding their phone book because they never know when there's going to be a crisis. Let's say Ukraine, when's there ever going to be a crisis in Ukraine? Come on. And of course, some days ago, NSA, it was like red alert, what you got on Ukraine. So they need the phone numbers, they need they need a giant phone book essentially, the email addresses, to be able to target stuff and collect in Ukraine. They need that all in advance. So one of the stories I found surfing around on Iran was that Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, had taken a kind of just a political trip basically to a mountainous region, and they knew about it in advance. It was like a big deal. He was going to go to this region, meet the people, give some speeches, shake hands, and NSA, with the help of GCHQ and CIA and other agencies, mounted a big effort to target this trip. Not because Ayatollah Khamenei was going to say anything, they expected him to say anything particularly interesting, but because his security folks, his logistics folks, everybody who works with him, his aides, would all be, moving around in a way that they could be detected. So they got NGA, the satellite people, to watch, and this whole operation was, they apparently learned a great deal about the sort of communications infrastructure of Iran, that if there were ever a crisis involving Iran, just in general, obviously Iran's a major target anyway, but if there were a crisis involving Iran, they'd be better able to tune in. So that's a lot of, those are examples of what we were looking at.
It's like Washington when they start ordering lots of takeout for the pizzas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or the Soviet diplomats were told in 1983 to drive around and see if there were lights on late at night in certain buildings for fear that Reagan was going to order a first nuclear strike against the Soviet Union.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Earlier you connected that excessive secrecy is bad for democracy and security. I think we were citing Tom Paine. Can you unfold that argument? What is it about secrecy that makes it a security threat?
Well, I guess he's made to me 2 points. One is the one that got a lot of attention after 9/11, which is that NSA, CIA, and FBI all had, when they looked at it in their files, critical information about the 9/11 plot and about some of the hijackers. And they didn't connect all that together. And if they had, the 9/11 Commission and others have identified sort of, like 10 points where the 9/11 plot might have been stopped. So that's one of the things, is that the secrecy is not just the government keeping things from the public, but one government agency keeping it from another government agency, treating everything as super classified. And some of it is not with the most laudable of motives. Some of it's like, our agency found this out and we want to get credit with the White House. We don't want everybody else to have credit. So that's a reason for hoarding. But in general, they'd say, if the more we spread this around, the more likely it is to leak, and then, grave damage will be done. The other thing that Kane once mentioned to me was, you probably, if you take a train, you probably get sick of, or even at, flying too, you get sick of these announcements, if you see something, say something. Essentially, in the post 9/11 period, we have learned, apparently, that empowering people with a certain degree of information, there was some information about the possibility that Al-Qaeda was going to use some new kind of bomb in shoes, and it went out to all law enforcement people. Now there's a tendency to spread information around. If you think about the reaction of the people on the flight on Christmas Day in 2009, when this guy set his underpants on fire, a Dutch guy leapt across the aisle and basically tackled him. And I mean, people were like engaged in a big way. And this isn't the air marshals, this is just regular flyers. That wouldn't have happened before 9/11, So there's a certain amount of information out there about threats that can be empowering to people and can make people safer. And that's getting beyond the government hoarding of information. I think that's what he's talking about. Yes?
I'm sure you're aware of the program PRISM that the NSA released, or Snowden released.
Sure.
So I don't know if you could talk about that a little bit and why that would be a bad thing for us, for Americans.
Well, it's not for me to really say it's a bad thing for Americans, but PRISM is under a particular section of the law that amended the FISA Act, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and it basically is a fairly elaborate bureaucratic mechanism by which the NSA, working through the FBI, collects a lot of information from big internet companies like Yahoo and Google and so on. It's only supposed to be non-US persons. I think what creeps people out about it is we all use Yahoo and Google and so on. And so it's a little bit shocking to find out that they're turning over a lot of information about their customers to the government. And even if it's information from the email of a non-US citizen, I may have been emailing with the non-US citizen. And in fact, NSA, under its rules, under the law, is allowed to do what they call incidental collection on Americans if they're not targeting the Americans, if they're targeting the foreigner, and the American is in communication with the foreigner, then they're allowed to collect that, and they just have certain rules on what they can do with it. Minimization rules they're called. So they can't just sort of send it out across the government. But so that creeps some people out. I'll tell you what really upset the companies, because the companies, of course, were approached about that collection, and they knew about that. What they didn't know is that NSA was simultaneously doing what they called upstream collection, where they're going into the sort of backbone of the internet, the fiber lines that carry everything, and sort of filtering it for stuff that was of interest. So I think from the point of view of companies like Microsoft and Google and Yahoo, there were the nice guys in suits with the lawyers who were coming in the front door to say, hey, we'd like this, that, and here's the legal paper. Meanwhile, the burglars were kind of coming in the back door and taking a lot of other stuff. And including, all these companies maintain big data centers overseas that are connected with each other. And there's, NSA was sitting on the lines in between. So that's really angered the Silicon Valley companies. And one of the long-term questions is whether these programs of NSA and their exposure by Snowden are in the long run going to do severe damage to some of the United States' most important companies. Maybe one more question, would you say, or anybody got one? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just related to that, like what's the incentive for the companies to cooperate with the government in the first place?
Well, in some cases they get court orders that order them to cooperate, and there have been some challenges, all under seal, where companies have tried not to cooperate, but it doesn't usually go very well. You really have to amend the law to limit the government's power to the court's power to order them to turn over certain data. In some cases, there is voluntary data turned over, and in many cases they're paid. This is still a little bit murky, but I suspect, as in most cases, money is at the root of it, and I suspect some of these companies are making a significant amount of money. In some cases, they're supposedly creating new capabilities to be able to turn information over to the government, and the government reimburses them for that. So there's a money factor as well. But I think these companies too are looking at the publicity and really thinking hard about how much cooperation they should be engaging in. Well, thank you all very much for listening to the great questions.